Welcome to chapters 17, 18, and 19 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Today we'll be finishing volume 1. That's a little bit longer because I wanted to finish those 3 chapters. So we're reading what Mr. Markham is reading, the story of Helen Graham and why she's here now. And we're up to the part now where she's interested in Mr. Huntingdon and what's going to happen next. So we'll encounter a few incidents in this reading. What do we think of Mr. Huntingdon? Are we suspicious of him, or is he in the up and up? Maybe he's a decent guy, but maybe there's something sinister lurking or about him. We don't know. Does his character bear further scrutiny, perhaps? That's what her aunt certainly seems to think. Her aunt doesn't trust him. All of this made me think a little bit about the rise of romance fraud, and it's out there. It is apparently $500 million business. Scary stuff. Unscrupulous people posing as potential romantic partners often will dupe women, sometimes men too, I'm sure, into taking part in some kind of a financial circumstance. You know, this poor guy, he's out of the country and he has no access to his bank. Just little things. And then a woman who is hypnotized by love or a man, I'm not trying to be pick on any gender, they become swindled and sometimes even unwittingly take part in money laundering and can get into some serious legal trouble themselves. So be careful, please. I will leave an actual video about one lady's story. It's only a 3-minute video that might be helpful to somebody. Anyway, watch it just so you're aware and tell others about it too. Let's get into the reading. Chapter 17, Further Warnings. The next day I accompanied my uncle and aunt to a dinner party at Mr. Wilmot's. He had 2 ladies staying with him, his niece, Annabella, a fine, dashing girl, or rather young woman, of some 25, too great a flirt to be married, according to her own assertion, but greatly admired by the gentlemen who universally pronounced her a splendid woman, and her gentle cousin Milicent Hargraves, who had taken a violent fancy to me, mistaking me for something vastly better than I was, and I in return was very fond of her. I should entirely exclude poor Milicent in my general animadversions against the ladies of my acquaintance, but it was not on her account or her cousins that I have mentioned the party. It was for the sake of another of Mr. Wilmot's guests, to wit, Mr. Huntingdon. I have good reason to remember his presence there, for this was the last time I saw him. He did not sit near me at dinner, for it was his fate to hand in a capacious old dowager, and mine to be handed in by Mr. Grimsby, a friend of his, but a man I very greatly disliked. There was a sinister cast in his countenance, and a mixture of lurking ferocity and a fulsome insincerity in his demeanor that I could not away with. What a tiresome custom that is, by the by, one among the many sources of factitious annoyance of this ultra-civilized life. If the gentlemen must lead the ladies into the dining room, why cannot they take those they like best? I am not sure, however, that Mr. Huntingdon would have taken me if he had been at liberty to make his own selection. It is quite possible he might have chosen Miss Wilmot, for she seemed bent upon engrossing his attention to herself, and he seemed nothing loath to pay the homage she demanded. I thought so, at least, when I saw how they talked and laughed, and glanced across the table to the neglect and evident umbrage of their respective neighbors, and afterwards, as the gentlemen joined us in the drawing-room, when she immediately upon his entrance loudly called upon him to be the arbiter of a dispute between herself and another lady, and he answered the summons with alacrity, and decided the question without a moment's hesitation, in her favor, though. To my thinking, she was obviously in the wrong, and then stood chatting familiarly with her and a group of other ladies, while I sat with Milicent Hargraves at the opposite end of the room, looking over the latter's drawings and airing her with my critical observations and advice at her particular desire. But in spite of my efforts to remain composed, my attention wandered from the drawings to the merry group, and against my better judgment, my wrath rose, and doubtless my countenance lowered. For Milicent, observing that I must be tired of her daubs and scratches, begged I would join the company now, and defer the examination of the remainder to another opportunity. But while I was assuring her that I had no wish to join them, and was not tired, Mr. Huntingdon himself came up to the little round table at which we sat. "Are these yours?" said he, carelessly taking up one of the drawings. "No, they are Miss Hargrave's." "Oh, well, let's have a look at them." And regardless of Miss Hargrave's protestations that they were not worth looking at, he drew a chair to my side, and receiving the drawings one by one from my hand, successively scanned them over and threw them on the table, but said not a word about them, though he was talking all the time. I don't know what Milicent Hargrave thought of such conduct, but I found his conversation extremely interesting, though, as I afterward discovered, when I came to analyze it, it was chiefly confined to quizzing the different members of the company present, and albeit he made some clever remarks and some excessively droll ones, I do not think the whole would appear anything very particular if written here without the adventitious aids of look and tone and gesture, and that ineffable but indefinite charm which cast a halo over all he did and said, and which would have made it a delight to look at his face and hear the music of his voice if he had been talking positive nonsense, and which moreover made me feel so bitter against my aunt when she put a stop to this enjoyment by coming composedly forward under pretense of wishing to see the drawings that she cared and knew nothing about, and while making believe to examine them, addressing herself to Mr. Huntingdon with one of her coldest and most repellent aspects, and beginning a series of the most commonplace and formidably formal questions and observations on purpose to wrest his attention from me, on purpose to vex me, as I thought, and having now looked through the portfolio, I left them to their tete-a-tete, and seated myself on the sofa quite apart from the company, never thinking how strange such conduct would appear, but merely to indulge at first the vexation of the moment, and subsequently to enjoy my private thoughts. But I was not left alone long, for Mr. Wilmot, of all men and the least welcome, took advantage of my isolated position to come and plant himself beside me. I had flattered myself that I had so effectually repulsed his advances on all former occasions that I had nothing more to apprehend from his unfortunate predilection. But it seems I was mistaken. So great was his confidence either in his wealth or his remaining powers of attraction, and so firm his conviction of feminine weakness, that he thought himself warranted to return to the siege, which he did with renovated ardor, enkindled by the quality of wine he had drunk, a circumstance that rendered him infinitely the more disgusting. But greatly as I abhorred him at that moment, I did not like to treat him with rudeness, as I was now his guest, and had just been enjoying his hospitality, and I was no hand at a polite but determined rejection, nor would it have greatly availed me if I had, for he was far too coarse-minded to take any repulse that he was not as plain and positive as his own effrontery. The consequence was that he waxed more fulsomely tender, more repulsively warm, and I was driven to the very verge of desperation, and about to say I know not what, when I felt my hand that hung over the arm of the sofa suddenly taken by another, and gently but fervently pressed. Instinctively I guessed who it was, and on looking up was less surprised than delighted to see Mr. Huntingdon smiling upon me. It was like turning from some purgatorial fiend to an angel of light, come to announce that the season of torment was past. "Helen, said he. He frequently called me Helen, and I never resented the freedom. I want you to look at this picture. Mr. Wilmot will excuse you a moment, I am sure. I rose with alacrity. He drew my arm within his and led me across the room to a splendid painting of Van Dyck's that I had noticed before but not sufficiently examined. After a moment of silent contemplation, I was beginning to comment on its beauties and peculiarities when, playfully pressing the hand he retained within his arm, he interrupted me with, "Never mind the picture. It was not for that I brought you here. It was to get you away from that scoundrelly old profligate yonder, who is looking as if he would like to challenge me for the affront." "I was very much obliged to you," said I. "This is twice you have delivered me from such unpleasant companionship." "Don't be too thankful," he answered. "It is not all kindness to you. It is partly from a feeling of spite to your tormentors that makes me delighted to do the old fellow a bad turn, though I don't think I have any great reason to dread them as rivals. Have I, Helen? You know I detest them both." "And me?" "I have no reason to detest you. But what are your sentiments toward me, Helen? Speak. How do you regard me?" And again he pressed my hand, but I feared there was more of a conscious power than tenderness in his demeanor, and I felt he had no right to extort a confession of attachment from me when he had made no correspondent avowal himself, and I knew not what to answer. At last I said, "How do you regard me?" "Sweet angel, I adore you. Helen, I want you for a moment," said the distinct low voice of my aunt close beside us, and I left him, muttering maledictions against his evil angel. "Well, aunt, what is it? What do you want?" said I, following her to the embrasure of the window. "I want you to join the company when you are fit to be seen," returned she, severely regarding me. "But please to stay here a little till that shocking color is somewhat abated and your eyes have recovered something of their natural expression. I should be ashamed for anyone to see you in your present state." Of course, such a remark had no effect in reducing the shocking color. To the contrary, I felt my face glow with redoubled fires kindled by a contemplation of emotions, of which indignant, swelling anger was the chief. I offered no reply, however, but pushed aside the curtain and looked into the night, or rather into the lamplit square. "Was Mr. Huntingdon proposing to you, Helen?" inquired my too watchful relative. "No." "What was he saying then? I heard something very like it." "I don't know what he would have said if you hadn't interrupted him." "And would you have accepted him, Helen, if he had proposed?" "Of course not, without consulting uncle and you." "Oh, I'm glad, my dear. You have so much prudence left. Well, now," she added, after a moment's pause, "you have made yourself conspicuous enough for one evening. The ladies are directing inquiring glances toward us at this moment, I see. I shall join them. Do you come too when you are sufficiently composed to appear as usual." "I am so now." "Speak gently then, and don't look so malicious," said my calm but provoking aunt. "We shall return home shortly, and then," she added with solemn significance, "I have much to say to you." So I went home prepared for a formidable lecture. Little was said by either party in the carriage during our short transit homewards, but when I had entered my room and thrown myself into an easy chair to reflect on the events of the day, my aunt followed me thither, and having dismissed Rachel, who was carefully stowing away my ornaments, closed the door, and placing a chair beside me, or rather at right angles with mine, sat down. With due deference, I offered her my more commodious seat. She declined it, and thus opened the conference. "Do you remember, Helen, our conversation the night but one before we left Stanningley?" "Yes, aunt." "And do you remember how I warned you against letting your heart be stolen from you by those untrustworthy of its possession, and fixing your affections where approbation did not go before, and where reason and judgment withheld their sanction?" "Yes, but my reason—" "Pardon me. And do you remember assuring me that there was no occasion for uneasiness on your account? For you should never be tempted to marry a man who was deficient in sense or principle, however handsome or charming in other aspects he might be, for you could not love him. You should hate, despise, pity, anything but love him. Were those not your words? Yes, but and did you not say that your affection must be founded on approbation, and that unless you could approve and honor and respect, you could not love? Yes, but I do approve and honor and respect. How so, my dear? Is Mr. Huntingdon a good man? He is a much better man than you think him. That is nothing to the purpose. Is he a good man? Yes, in some respects. He has a good disposition. Is he a man of principle? Perhaps not exactly, but it is only for want of thought. If he had someone to advise him and remind him of what is right, he would soon learn, you think, and you yourself would willingly undertake to be his teacher. But, my dear, he is, I believe, full 10 years older than you. And how is it that you are so beforehand in moral acquirements? Thanks to you, my aunt. I have been well brought up and had good examples always before me, which he, most likely, has not. And besides, he is of a sanguine temperament and a gay, thoughtless temper, and I am naturally inclined to reflection. Well, now you have made him out to be deficient in both sense and principle by your own confessions. Then my sense and my principle are at his service. That sounds presumptuous, Helen. Do you think you have enough for both? And do you imagine your merry, thoughtless profligate would allow himself to be guided by a young girl like you? No, I should not wish to guide him, but I think I might have influence sufficient to save him from some errors, and I should think my life well spent in the effort to preserve so noble a nature from destruction. He always listens attentively now when I speak seriously to him, and I always venture to reprove his random way of talking. And sometimes he says that if he had me always by his side, he should never do nor say a wicked thing, and that a little daily talk with me would make him quite a saint. It may be partly jest and partly flattery, but still you think it may be truth? If I do think there is any mixture of truth in it, it is not from confidence in my own powers, but in his natural goodness. And you have no right to call him a profligate, aunt. He is nothing of the kind. Who told you so, my dear? What was the story about his intrigue with a married lady? Lady, who was it? Miss Wilmot herself was telling you the other day. It was false. False, I cried. I don't believe a word of it. You think, then, that he is a virtuous, well-conducted young man? I know nothing positive respecting his character. I only know that I have heard nothing definitive against it, nothing that could be proved at least, and till people can prove their slanderous accusations, I will not believe them. And I know this, that if he has committed errors, they are only such as are common to youth, and such as nobody thinks anything about, for I see that everybody likes him. And all the mammas smile upon him and their daughters, and Miss Wilmot herself are only too glad to attract his attention. Helen, the world may look upon such offences as venial. A few unprincipled mothers may be anxious to catch a young man of fortune without reference to his character, and thoughtless girls may be glad to win the smiles of so handsome a gentleman without seeking to penetrate beyond the surface. But you, I trusted, were better informed than to see with their eyes and judge with their perverted judgment. I did not think you would call these venial errors. Nor do I, aunt, but if I hate the sins, I love the sinner, and would do much for his salvation, even supposing your suspicions to be mainly true, which I do not and will not believe. Well, my dear, ask your uncle what sort of company he keeps, and if he is not banded with a set of loose, profligate young men, whom he calls his friends, his jolly companions, and whose chief delight is to wallow in vice and vie with each other. Who can run fastest and farthest down the headlong road to the place prepared for the devil and his angels? Then I will save him from them. Oh, Helen, Helen, you little know the misery of uniting your fortunes to such a man. I have such confidence in him, aunt, notwithstanding all you say, that I would willingly risk my happiness for the chance of securing his. I will leave better men to those who only consider their own advantage. If he has done amiss, I shall consider my life well spent in saving him from the consequences of his early errors, and striving to recall him to the path of virtue. God grant me success." Here the conversation ended, for at this juncture my uncle's voice was heard from his chamber, loudly calling upon my aunt to come to bed. He was in a bad humor that night, for his gout was worse. It had been gradually increasing upon him ever since we came to town, and my aunt took advantage of the circumstance next morning to persuade him to return to the country immediately, without waiting for the close of the season. His physician supported and enforced her arguments, and, contrary to her usual habits, she so hurried the preparations for removal, as much for my sake as for my uncle's, I think, that in a few days we departed, and I saw no more of Mr. Huntingdon. My aunt flatters herself I shall soon forget him. Perhaps she thinks I have forgotten him already, for I never mention his name, and she may continue to think so till we meet again. If ever that should be, I wonder if it will. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18, the miniature. August 25th. I am now quite settled down to my usual routine of steady occupations and quiet amusements, tolerably contented and cheerful, but still looking forward to spring with the hope of returning to town. Not for its gaieties and dissipations, but for the chance of meeting Mr. Huntingdon once again, for still he is always in my thoughts and in my dreams. In all my employments, whatever I do or see or hear has an ultimate reference to him. Whatever skill or knowledge I acquire is some day to be turned to his advantage or amusement. Whatever new beauties in nature or art I discover are to be depicted to meet his eye, or stored in my memory to be told him at some future period. This, at least, is the hope that I cherish, the fancy that lights me on my lonely way. It may be only an ignis fatuus, after all, but it can do no harm to follow it with my eyes and rejoice in its luster, as long as it does not lure me from the path I ought to keep. And I think it will not, for I have thought deeply on my aunt's advice, and I see clearly now the folly of throwing myself away on one that is unworthy of all the love I have to give, and incapable of responding to the best and deepest feelings of my inmost heart, so clearly that even if I should see him again, and if he should remember me and love me still, which, alas, is too probable considering how he is situated, by whom surrounded, and if he should ask me to marry him, I am determined not to consent until I know for certain whether my aunt's opinion of him or mine is nearest the truth. For if mine is altogether wrong, it is not he that I love, it is a creature of my own imagination. But I think it is not wrong. No, no, there is a secret something, an inward instinct that assures me I am right. There is essential goodness in him, and what delight to unfold it! If he has wandered, what bliss to recall him! If he is now exposed to the baneful influence of corrupting and wicked companions, what glory to deliver him from them! Oh, if I could but believe that heaven has designed me for this! Today is the 1st of September, but my uncle has ordered the gamekeeper to spare the partridges till the gentlemen come. What gentleman? I asked, when I heard it. A small party he had invited to shoot. His friend, Mr. Wilmot, was one, and my aunt's friend, Mr. Boarham, another. This struck me as terrible news at the moment, but all regret and apprehension vanished like a dream when I heard that Mr. Huntingdon was actually to be a third. My aunt was greatly against his coming, of course. She earnestly endeavored to dissuade my uncle from asking him, but he, laughing at her objections, told her it was no use talking, for the mischief was already done. He had invited Huntingdon and his friend Lord Lowborough before we left London, and nothing now remained but to fix the day for their coming. So he is safe, and I am sure of seeing him. I cannot express my joy. I find it very difficult to conceal it from my aunt, but I don't wish to trouble her with my feelings till I know whether I ought to indulge them or not. If I find it my absolute duty to suppress them, they shall trouble no one but myself. And if I can really feel myself justified in indulging this attachment, I can dare anything, even the anger and grief of my best friend, for its object surely I shall soon know. But they are not coming till about the middle of the month. We are to have two lady visitors also. Mr. Wilmot is to bring his niece and her cousin, Milicent. I suppose my aunt thinks the latter will benefit me by her society and the salutary example of her gentle deportment and lowly and tractable spirit, and the former, I suspect she intends as a species of counter-attraction to win Mr. Huntingdon's attention from me. I don't thank her for this, but I shall be glad of Millicent's company. She is a sweet, good girl, and I wish I were like her, more like her at least than I am. 19th. They are come. They came the day before yesterday. The gentlemen are all gone out to shoot, and the ladies are with my aunt at work in the drawing room. I have retired to the library, for I am very unhappy, and I want to be alone. Books cannot divert me, so having opened my desk, I will try what may be done by detailing the cause of my uneasiness. This paper will serve instead of a confidential friend into whose ear I might pour forth the overflowings of my heart. It will not sympathize with my distresses, but then it will not laugh at them, and if I keep it close, it cannot tell again. So it is perhaps the best friend I could have for the purpose. First, let me speak of his arrival. How I sat at my window and watched for nearly 2 hours before his carriage entered the park gates, for they all came before him, and how deeply I was disappointed at every arrival, because it was not his. First came Mr. Wilmot and the ladies. When Milicent had gone into her room, I quitted my post a few minutes to look in upon her and have a little private conversation, for she was now my intimate friend. Several long epistles have passed between us since our parting. On returning to my window, I beheld another carriage at the door. Was it his? No, it was Mr. Boarham's plain dark chariot, and there he stood upon the steps, carefully superintending the dislodging of his various boxes and packages. What a collection! One would have thought he projected a visit of 6 months at least. A considerable time after came Lord Lowborough in his barouche. Is he one of the profligate friends, I wonder? I should think not, for no one could call him a jolly companion, I'm sure, and besides, he appears too sober and gentlemanly in his demeanour to merit such suspicions. He is a tall, thin, gloomy-looking man, apparently between 30 and 40, and of a somewhat sickly, careworn aspect. At last Mr. Huntingdon's light phaeton came bowling merrily up the lawn. I had but a transient glimpse of him. For the moment it stopped, he sprang out over the side on to the portico steps and disappeared into the house. I now submitted to be dressed for dinner, a duty which Rachel had been urging upon me for the last 20 minutes, and when that important business was completed, I repaired to the drawing-room, where I found Mr. and Miss Wilmot and Milicent Hargrave already assembled. Shortly after, Lord Lowborough entered, and then Mr. Boarham, who seemed quite willing to forget and forgive my former conduct, and to hope that a little conciliation and steady perseverance on his part might yet succeed in bringing me to reason. While I stood at the window conversing with Milicent, he came up to me and was beginning to talk in nearly his usual strain when Mr. Huntingdon entered the room. How will he greet me, I wonder? Said my bounding heart, and instead of advancing to meet him, I turned to the window to hide or subdue my emotion. But having saluted his host and hostess, the rest of the company, he came to me, ardently squeezed my hand, and murmured he was glad to see me once again. At that moment dinner was announced. My aunt desired him to take Miss Hargrave into the dining-room, and odious Mr. Wilmot, with unspeakable grimaces, offered his arm to me. and I was condemned to sit between himself and Mr. Boarham. But afterwards, when we were all again assembled in the drawing room, I was indemnified for so much suffering by a few delightful minutes of conversation with Mr. Huntingdon. In the course of the evening, Miss Wilmot was called upon to sing and play for the amusement of the company, and I to exhibit my drawings. And though he likes music, and she is an accomplished musician, I think I am right in affirming that he paid more attention to my drawings than to her music. So far, so good. But hearing him pronounce sotto voce, but with particular emphasis concerning one of the pieces, this is better than all. I looked up, curious to see which it was, and to my horror, beheld him complacently gazing at the back of the picture. It was his own face that I had sketched there and forgotten to rub out. To make matters worse, in the agony of the moment, I attempted to snatch it from his hand, but he prevented me, and exclaiming, "No, by George, I'll keep it," and placed it against his waistcoat and buttoned his coat upon it with a delighted chuckle. Then, drawing a candle close to his elbow, he gathered all the drawings to himself as well as what he had seen as the others, and muttering, "I must look at both sides now," he eagerly commenced an examination, which I watched at first with tolerable composure, in the confidence that his vanity would not be gratified by any further discoveries, for though I must plead guilty to having disfigured the backs of several with abortive attempts to delineate that too fascinating physiognomy, I was secure that, with the one unfortunate exception, I had carefully obliterated all such witnesses of my infatuation. But the pencil frequently leaves an impression upon cardboard that no amount of rubbing can efface. Such, it seems, was the case with most of these. And I confess I trembled when I saw him looking at them so closely to the candle and poring so intently over the seeming blanks. But still, I trusted he would not be able to make out these dim traces to his own satisfaction. I was mistaken, however. Having ended his scrutiny, he quietly remarked, "I perceive the backs of young ladies' drawings, like the postscripts to their letters, are the most important and interesting part of the concern." Then, leaning back in his chair, he reflected a few minutes in silence, complacently smiling to himself. And while I was concocting some cutting speech wherewith to check his gratification, he rose, and passing over to where Annabella Wilmot sat, vehemently coquetting with Lord Lowborough, seated himself on the sofa beside her, and attracted himself to her for the rest of the evening. So then, thought I, he despises me because he knows I love him. And the reflection made me so miserable I knew not what to do. Milicent came and began to admire my drawings and make remarks upon them, but I could not talk to her. I could talk to no one. And upon the introduction of tea, I took advantage of the open door and the slight diversion caused by its entrance to slip out, for I was sure I could not take any, and take refuge in the library. My aunt sent Thomas in quest of me to ask if I were not coming to tea, but I bade him say that I should not take any tonight, and happily she was too much occupied with her guests to make any further inquiries at the time. As most of the company had traveled far that day, they retired early to rest, and having heard them all, as I thought, go upstairs, I ventured out to get my candlestick from the drawing-room sideboard. But Mr. Huntingdon had lingered behind the rest, and he was just at the foot of the stairs when I opened the door, and hearing my step in the hall, though I could hardly hear it myself, he instantly turned back. "Helen, is that you?" said he. "Why did you run away from us?" "Good night, Mr. Huntingdon," said I coldly, not choosing to answer the question, and I turned away to enter the drawing-room. "But you'll shake hands, won't you?" said he, placing himself at the doorway before me. And he seized my hand and held it much against my will. "Let me go, Mr. Huntingdon," said I. "I want to get a candle." "The candle will keep," returned he. I made a desperate effort to free my hand from his grasp. "Why are you in such a hurry to leave me, Helen?" he said, with a smile of the most provoking self-sufficiency. "You don't hate me, you know." "Yes, I do, at this moment." "Not you. It is Annabella Wilmot you hate, not me." "I have nothing to do with Annabella Wilmot," said I, burning with indignation. But I have, you know, returned he with particular emphasis. That is nothing to me, sir, I retorted. Is it nothing to you, Helen? Will you swear it? Will you? No, I won't, Mr. Huntingdon, and I will go, cried I, not knowing whether to laugh or cry or to break out into a tempest of fury. Go then, you vixen, he said, but the instant he released my hand, he had the audacity to put his arm around my neck and kiss me. Trembling with anger and agitation, and I don't know what besides, I broke away. I got my candle and rushed upstairs to my room. He would not have done so but for that hateful picture, and there he had it still in his possession, an eternal monument to his pride and my humiliation. It was but little sleep I got that night, and in the morning I rose perplexed and troubled with the thought of meeting him at breakfast. I knew not how it was to be done. An assumption of dignified, cold indifference could hardly do after what he knew about my devotion, to his face at least. Yet something must be done to check his presumption. I would not submit to be tyrannized over by those bright laughing eyes, and accordingly I received his cheerful morning salutation so calmly and coldly as my aunt could have wished, and defeated with brief answers his one or two attempts to draw me into conversation, while I comported myself with usual cheerfulness and compliance toward every other member of the party, especially Annabella Wilmot. And even her uncle and Mr. Boarham were treated with an extra amount of civility on the occasion, not from any motives of coquetry, but just to show him that my particular coolness and reserve arose from no general ill humor or depression of spirits. He was not, however, to be repelled by such acting as this. He did not talk much to me, but when he did speak, it was with a degree of freedom and openness, and kindliness too, that plainly seemed to intimate he knew his words were music to my ears. And when his looks met mine, it was with a smile, presumptuous it might be, but oh, so sweet, so bright, so genial, that I could not possibly regain my anger. Every vestige of displeasure soon melted away beneath it, like morning clouds before the summer sun. Soon after breakfast, all the gentlemen save one, with boyish eagerness, set out for their expedition against the hapless partridges. My uncle and Mr. Wilmot on their shooting ponies, Mr. Huntingdon and Lord Lowborough on their legs, and the one exception being Mr. Boarham, who, in consideration of the rain that had fallen during the night, thought it prudent to remain behind a little and join them in a while, when the sun had dried the grass. And he favored us all with a long and minute disquisition upon the evils and dangers attendant upon damp feet, delivered with the most imperturbable gravity amid the jeers and laughter of Mr. Huntingdon and my uncle, who, leaving the prudent sportsman to entertain the ladies with his medical discussions, sailed forth with their guns, bending their steps to the stables first to have a look at the horses and let out the dogs. Not desirous of sharing Mr. Boarham's company for the whole of the morning, I betook myself to the library, and there brought forth my easel and began to paint. The easel and the painting apparatus would serve as an excuse for abandoning the drawing-room, if my aunt should come to complain of the desertion, and besides, I wanted to finish the picture. It was one I had taken great pains with, and I intended it to be my masterpiece, though it was somewhat presumptuous in the design. By the bright azure of the sky, and by the warm and brilliant lights and deep, long shadows, I had endeavored to convey the idea of a sunny morning. I had ventured to give more of the bright verdure of spring or early summer to the grass and foliage than is commonly attempted in painting. The scene represented was an open glade in a wood. A group of dark Scotch firs was introduced in the middle distance to relieve the prevailing freshness of the rest, but in the foreground were part of the gnarled trunk and of the spreading boughs of the large forest tree, whose foliage was of a brilliant golden green, not golden from autumnal mellowness, but from the sunshine and the very immaturity of the scarce expanded leaves. Upon this bough that stood out in bold relief against the sombre firs were seated an amorous pair of turtle-doves, whose soft and colored plumage afforded a contrast of another nature, and beneath it a young girl was kneeling on the daisy-spangled turf, with head thrown back and masses of fair hair falling on her shoulders, her hands clasped, lips parted, and eyes intently gazing upward in pleased yet earnest contemplation of those feathered lovers, too deeply absorbed in each other to notice her. I had scarcely settled to my work, which, however, wanted but a few touches to the finishing, when the sportsmen passed the window on their return from the stables. It was partly open, and Mr. Huntingdon must have seen me as he went by, for in half a minute he came back, and setting his gun against the wall, threw up the sash and sprung in and set himself before my picture. "Very pretty, i'faith," said he, after attentively regarding it for a few seconds, "and a very fitting study for a young lady. Spring just opening into summer, morning just approaching noon, girlhood just ripening into womanhood, and hope just verging on fruition. She's a sweet creature, but why didn't you make her hair black?" "I thought light hair would suit her better. You see, I have made her blue-eyed and plump and fair and rosy." "Upon my word, a very Hebe! I should fall in love with her if I hadn't the artist before me. Sweet, innocent. She's thinking there will come a time when she will be wooed and won like that pretty hen dove, by as fond and fervent a lover, and she's thinking how pleasant it will be, and how tender and faithful he will find her." "And perhaps," suggested I, "how tender and faithful she shall find him." "Perhaps, for there is no limit to the wild extravagance of Hope's imaginings at such an age." "Do you call that, then, one of her wild, extravagant delusions?" "No, my heart tells me it is not. I might have thought so once, but now I say, give me the girl I love, and I will swear eternal constancy to her and her alone, through summer and winter, through youth and age and life and death, if age and death must come." He spoke this in such a serious earnestness that my heart bounded with delight. But the minute after he changed his tone and asked with a significant smile if I had any more portraits. "No," replied I, reddening with confusion and wrath. But my portfolio was on the table, and he took it up and coolly sat down to examine its contents. "Mr. Huntingdon, those are my unfinished sketches," cried I, "and I never let anyone see them." And I placed my hand on the portfolio to wrest it from him, but he maintained his hold, assuring me that he liked unfinished sketches of all things. "But I hate them to be seen," returned I. "I can't let you have it, indeed." "Let me have its bowels, then," said he, and just as I wrenched the portfolio from his hand, he deftly abstracted the greater part of its contents, and after turning them over a moment, he cried out, "Bless my stars, here's another," and slipped a small oval of ivory paper into his waistcoat pocket, a complete miniature portrait that I had sketched with such tolerable success as to be induced to color it with great pains and care, but I was determined he should not keep it. "Mr. Huntingdon," cried I insist upon having that back. It is mine, and you have no right to take it. Give it to me directly. I'll never forgive you if you don't." But the more vehemently I insisted, the more he aggravated my distress by his insulting, gleeful laugh. At length, however, he restored it to me, saying, "Well, well, since you value it so much, I'll not deprive you of it." To show him how I valued it, I tore it in two and threw it into the fire. He was not prepared for this. His merriment suddenly ceasing, he stared in mute amazement at the consuming treasure, and then, with careless "Humph! I'll go and shoot now," he turned on his heel and vacated the apartment by the window as he came, and, setting on his hat with an air, took up his gun and walked away, whistling as he went, and leaving me not too much agitated to finish my picture, for I was glad at that moment that I had vexed him. When I returned to the drawing-room, I found Mr. Boarham had ventured to follow his comrades to the field, and shortly after lunch, to which they did not think of returning, I volunteered to accompany the ladies for a walk and show Annabella and Milicent the beauties of the country. We took a long ramble, and re-entered the park just as the sportsmen were returning from their expedition. Toil spent and travel strained, the main body of them crossed over the grass to avoid us, but Mr. Huntingdon, all spattered and splashed as he was, and stained with the blood of his prey, to the no small offense of my aunt's strict sense of propriety, came out of his way to meet us, with cheerful smiles and words for all but me, and placing himself between Annabella Wilmot and myself, walked up the road and began to relate the various exploits and disasters of the day in a manner that would have convulsed me with laughter if I had been on good terms with him, but he addressed himself entirely to Annabella. And I, of course, left all the laughter and all the badinage to her, and affecting the utmost indifference to whatever passed between them, walked along a few paces apart, and looking every way but theirs, while my aunt and Milicent went before, linked arm in arm, and gravely discoursing together. At length Mr. Huntingdon turned to me, and addressing me in a confidential whisper, said, "Helen, why did you burn my picture?" "Because I wished to destroy it," I answered with an asperity it is useless now to lament. "Oh, very good," was the reply. "If you don't value me, I must turn to somebody that will." I thought it was partly in jest, a half-playful mixture of mock resignation and pretended indifference, but immediately he resumed his place beside Miss Wilmot, and from that hour to this, during all the evening, and all the next day, and the next, and the next, and all this morning, the 22nd, he has never given me one kind word or one pleasant look, never spoken to me but from pure necessity, never glanced toward me but with a cold, unfriendly look I thought him quite incapable of assuming. My aunt observes the change, and though she has not inquired the cause or made any remark to me on the subject, I see it gives her pleasure. Miss Wilmot observes it too, and triumphantly ascribes it to her own superior charms and blandishments, but I am truly miserable, more so than I like to acknowledge to myself. Pride refuses to aid me. It has brought me into the scrape and will not help me out of it. He meant no harm. It was only his joyous, playful spirit, and I, by my acrimonious resentment, so serious, so disproportioned to the offense, have so wounded his feelings, so deeply offended him, that I fear he will never forgive me. And all for a mere jest. He thinks I dislike him, and he must continue to think so. I must lose him forever, and Annabella may win him and triumph as she will. But it is not my loss, nor her triumph, that I deplore so greatly as the wreck of my fond hopes for his advantage, and her unworthiness of his affection, and the injury he will do to himself by trusting his happiness to her. She does not love him. She thinks only of herself. She cannot appreciate the good that is in him. She will neither see it, nor value it, nor cherish it. She will neither deplore his faults, nor attempt their amendment, but rather aggravate them by her own. And I doubt whether she will not deceive him after all. I see she is playing double between him and Lord Lowborough, and while she amuses herself with the lively Huntingdon, she tries her utmost to enslave his moody friend, and should she succeed in bringing both to her feet, the fascinating commoner will have but little chance against the lordly peer. If he observes her artful byplay, it gives him no uneasiness, but rather adds new zest to his diversion by opposing a stimulating check to his otherwise too easy conquest. Messrs. Wilmot and Boarham have severally taken occasion by his neglect of me to renew their advances, and if I were like Annabella and some others, I should take advantage of their perseverance to endeavor to pique him into a revival of affection, but justice and honesty apart, I could not bear to do it. I am annoyed enough by their present persecutions without encouraging them further, and even if I ever did, it would have precious little effect upon him. He sees me suffering under the condescending attentions and prosaic discourses of the one, and the repulsive obtrusions of the other, without so much of a shadow of commiseration for me, or resentment against my tormentors. He never could have loved me, or he would not have resigned me so willingly, and he would not go on talking to everybody else so cheerfully as he does, laughing and jesting with Lord Lowborough and my uncle, teasing Milicent Hargraves, and flirting with Annabella Wilmot, as if nothing were on his mind. Oh, why can't I hate him? I must be infatuated, or I should scorn to regret him as I do. But I must rally all the powers I have remaining and try to tear him from my heart. There goes the dinner bell, and here comes my aunt to scold me for sitting here at my desk all day instead of staying with the company. I wish the company were gone. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19, An Incident. 22nd, still August. Night. What have I done? And what will be the end of it? I cannot calmly reflect upon it. I cannot sleep. I must have recourse to my diary again. I will commit it to paper tonight and see what I shall think of it tomorrow. I went down to dinner, resolving to be cheerful and well conducted and keep my resolution very creditably, considering how my head ached and how internally wretched I felt. I don't know what has come over me of late. My very energies, both mental and physical, must be strangely impaired, or I should not have acted so weakly in many respects as I have done. But I have not been well these last days or two. I suppose it is with sleeping and eating so little and thinking so much and being so continually out of humor. But to return, I was exerting myself to sing and play for the amusement, and at the request of my aunt and Milicent, before the gentlemen came into the drawing room. Miss Wilmot never likes to waste her musical efforts on ladies' ears alone. Milicent had asked for a little Scotch song, and I was just in the middle of it when they entered. The first thing Mr. Huntingdon did was to walk up to Annabella. "Now, Miss Wilmot, won't you give us some music tonight?" said he. "Do now, I know you will, when I tell you that I have been hungering and thirsting all day for the sound of your voice. Come, the piano's vacant." It was, for I had quitted it immediately upon hearing his petition. Had I been endowed with a proper degree of self-possession, I should have turned to the lady myself and cheerfully joined my entreaties to his, whereby I should have disappointed his expectations if the affront had been purposefully given, or made it sensible of the wrong if it had only arisen from thoughtlessness. But I felt it too deeply to do anything but rise from the music stool and throw myself back on the sofa, suppressing with difficulty the audible expression of the bitterness I felt within. I knew Annabella's musical talents were superior to mine, but there was no reason why I should be treated as a perfect nonentity. The time and the matter of his asking her appeared like a gratuitous insult to me, and I could have wept with pure vexation. Meanwhile, she exultantly seated herself at the piano and favored him with two of his favorite songs in such superior style that even I soon lost my anger in admiration and listened with a sort of gloomy pleasure to the skillful modulations of her full-toned and powerful voice, so judiciously aided by her rounded and spirited touch. And while my ears drank in the sound, my eyes rested on the face of her principal auditor, and derived an equal or superior delight from the contemplation of his speaking countenance. As he stood beside her, that eye and brow lighted up with keen enthusiasm, and that sweet smile passing and appearing like gleams of sunshine on an April day. No wonder he should hunger and thirst to hear her sing. I now forgave him from my heart his reckless slight of me, and I felt ashamed at my pettish resentment of such a trifle. Ashamed, too, of those bitter envious pangs that gnawed my inmost heart, in spite of all this admiration and delight. "There now," said she, playfully running her fingers over the keys, when she had concluded the second song. "What shall I give you next?" But in saying this, she looked back at Lord Lowborough, who was standing a little behind, leaning against the back of a chair, an attentive listener, too, experiencing, to judge by his countenance, much the same feelings of mingled pleasure and sadness as I did. But the look she gave him plainly said, "Do you choose for me now? I have done enough for him, and will gladly exert myself to gratify you." And thus encouraged, his lordship came forward, and turning over the music, presently set before her a little song that I had noticed before, and read more than once with an interest arising from the circumstance of my connecting it in my mind with the reigning tyrant of my thoughts. And now, with my nerves already excited and half unstrung, I could not hear those words so sweetly warbled forth without some symptoms of emotion I was not able to suppress. Tears rose unbidden to my eyes, and I buried my face in the sofa pillow that they might flow unseen while I listened. The air was simple, sweet, and sad. It is still running in my head, and so are the words. Farewell to thee, but not farewell to all my fondest thoughts of thee. Within my heart they still shall dwell, and they shall cheer and comfort me. O beautiful and full of grace, if thou hadst never met mine eye, I had not dreamed a living face could fancied charms so far outvie. If I may ne'er behold again that form and face so dear to me, nor hear thy voice, still would I fain preserve for aye their memory. That voice, the magic of whose tone can wake an echo in my breast, creating feelings that alone can make my tranced spirit blessed. That laughing eye, whose sunny beam from memory would not cherish less. And oh, that smile, whose joyous gleam no mortal language can suppress. Adieu, but let me cherish still the hope with which I cannot part. Contempt may wound and coldness chill, but still it lingers in my heart. And who can tell but heaven at last may answer all my thousand prayers, and bid the future pay the past with joy for anguish, smiles for tears. When it ceased, I longed for nothing so much as to be out of the room. The sofa was not far from the door, but I did not dare to raise my head, for I knew Mr. Huntingdon was standing near me, and I knew by the sound of his voice as he spoke in answer to some remark of Lord Lowborough's that his face was turning towards me. Perhaps a half-suppressed sob had caught his ear and caused him to look round. Heaven forbid! But with a violent effort I checked all further signs of weakness, dried my eyes, and when I thought he had turned away again, rose and instantly left the apartment, taking refuge in my favorite resort, the library. There was no light there, but the faint red glow of the neglected fire. But I did not want a light. I only wanted to indulge my thoughts, unnoticed and undisturbed. And sitting down on a low stool before the easy chair, I sunk my head upon its cushioned seat and thought, until the tears gushed out again, and I wept like a child. Presently, however, the door was gently opened, and someone entered the room. I trusted it was only a servant, and did not stir. The door was closed again, but I was not alone. A hand gently touched my shoulder, and a voice said softly, "Helen, what is the matter?" I could not answer at the moment. "You must and shall tell me," was added more vehemently, and the speaker threw himself on his knees beside me on the rug and forcibly possessed himself of my hand. But I hastily caught it away and replied, "It is nothing to you, Mr. Huntingdon." "Are you sure it is nothing to me?" he returned. "Can you swear that you were not thinking of me while you wept?" This was unendurable. I made an effort to rise, but he was kneeling on my dress. "Tell me," continued he. "I want to know, because if you were, I have something to say to you, and if not, I'll go." "Go then," I cried, but fearing he would obey too well and never come again, I added hastily, "Or say what you have to say and have done with it." "But which?" said he, "for I shall only say it if you really were thinking of me. So tell me, Helen." "You're excessively impertinent, Mr. Huntingdon." "Not at all. Too pertinent, you mean. So you won't tell me? Well, I'll spare your woman's pride. And construing your silence into yes, I'll take it for granted that I was the subject of your thoughts and the cause of your affliction." "Indeed, sir!" "If you deny it, I won't tell you my secret," threatened he, and I did not interrupt him again, or even attempt to repulse him, though he had taken my hand once more and half embraced me with his other arm. I was scarcely conscious of it at the time. "It is this," resumed he, "that Annabella Wilmot, in comparison with you, is like a flaunting peony compared with a sweet wild rosebud gemmed with dew, and I love you to distraction. Now tell me, if that intelligence gives you any pleasure. Silence again? That means yes. Then let me add that I cannot live without you, and if you answer no to this last question, you will drive me mad. Will you bestow yourself upon me? You will, he cried, nearly squeezing me to death in his arms. No, no, I exclaimed, struggling to free myself from him. You must ask my uncle and aunt. They won't refuse me if you don't. I'm not so sure of that. My aunt dislikes you, but you don't, Helen. You say you love me, and I'll go. I wish you would go, I replied. I will this instant, if you'll only say you love me. You know I do, I answered, and again he caught me in his arms and smothered me with kisses. At that moment, my aunt opened the door wide and stood before us, candle in hand, in shocked and horrified amazement, gazing alternately at Mr. Huntingdon and me, for we had both started up and now stood wide enough asunder. But his confusion was only for a moment. Rallying in an instant with the most enviable assurance, he began, I beg 10,000 pardons, Mrs. Maxwell. Don't be too severe upon me. I've been asking your sweet niece to take me for better or for worse, and she, like a good girl, informs me she cannot think of it without her uncle's and aunt's consent. So let me implore you not to condemn me to eternal wretchedness. If you favor my cause, I am safe. For Mr. Maxwell, I am certain, can refuse you nothing. We will talk of this tomorrow, sir, said my aunt coldly. It is a subject that demands mature and serious deliberation. At present, you had better return to the drawing-room. But meantime, pleaded he, let me commend my cause to your most indulgent. No indulgence for you, Mr. Huntingdon, must come between me and the consideration of my niece's happiness. Ah, true, I know she is an angel, and I am a presumptuous dog to dream of possessing such a treasure, but nevertheless I would sooner die than relinquish her in favor of the best man that ever went to heaven. And as for her happiness, I would sacrifice my body and soul. Body and soul, Mr. Huntingdon. Sacrifice your soul? Well, I would lay down my life. You would not be required to lay it down. I would spend it then, devote my life with all its power to the promotion and preservation. Another time, sir, we will talk of this, and I should have felt disposed to judge more favorably of your pretensions if you two had chosen another time and place, and let me add another manner for your declaration. Why, you see, Mrs. Maxwell, he began. Pardon me, sir, said she with dignity. The company are inquiring for you in the other room, and she turned to me. Then you must plead for me, Helen, said he, and at length withdrew. You had better retire to your room, Helen, said my aunt gravely. I will discuss this matter with you, too, tomorrow. Don't be angry, aunt, said I. My dear, I am not angry, she replied. I am surprised. If it is true that you told him you would not accept his offer without our consent— It is true, interrupted I. Then how could you permit— I couldn't help it, aunt, I cried, bursting into tears. They were not altogether the tears of sorrow or of the fear of her displeasure, but rather the outbreak of the general tumultuous excitement of my feelings. But my good aunt was touched at my agitation. In a softer tone, she repeated her recommendation to retire, and gently kissing my forehead, bade me good night, and put her candle in my hand, and I went. But my brain worked so I could not think of sleeping. I feel calmer now that I have written all this, and I will go to bed and try to win tired nature's sweet restorer. End of chapter 19 and end of volume 1.